He pointed a gun at her face because he thought she'd stay silent. Officer Reynolds saw a black woman alone on a desert road and assumed she'd be afraid. That she'd follow orders. That she'd fold. Her name was Evelyn Monroe, a 62-year-old grandmother, patriot, and the newly appointed director of federal intelligence. He didn't know that, and he didn't care. But when they picked Evelyn, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she had spent decades fighting terrorism, negotiating under threat, and training agents like him, men who let power go to their heads. And what came next wasn't just justice, it was exposure. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Sunset spilled across the empty highway, casting gold over Evelyn's windshield. The wind had gone still. Behind her, the red and blue lights pulsed. Ahead, nothing but silence, steel, and one woman's decision to stand her ground. The desert highway stretched for miles, empty and quiet beneath a fading blue sky. It was nearly dusk when Evelyn Monroe, newly appointed head of a federal intelligence agency, merged onto the two-lane road with nothing but the sound of tires and wind. At 62, Evelyn had learned how to carry pressure like an old friend. After decades in the field, today's top-secret meeting should have been just another chapter. But her mind lingered on what was said behind those closed doors. Decisions were made, heavy ones. Ones that kept her awake longer than she cared to admit. She glanced at the dashboard clock. 6:12 p.m. She had been driving for over an hour, reflecting in silence, no music, no distractions, just the steady hum of the engine and the raw edge of instinct. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the sun dipped a little too quickly below the hills, or how the air had grown strangely still. She adjusted the rearview mirror, checking the empty stretch behind her. Nothing, just road and brush. Yet something inside her stirred. A kind of quiet vigilance. It was something only time could teach. A feeling older folks often called a whisper from the bones. Evelyn had learned never to ignore it. Who among us hasn't felt that sudden alertness, that tightening in the chest, without knowing exactly why? Her hands relaxed slightly on the steering wheel. She breathed in deep. This road was familiar. She'd driven it dozens of times over the years. But tonight, it held a different weight. A memory flickered. Her father's voice, back when she was a girl. Even when the road looks clear, baby girl, always drive with your eyes open and your spirit sharper. And so she did, eyes open, spirit sharp. It was the calm before the storm. A sudden flash of red and blue shattered the stillness like a siren in a cathedral. Evelyn squinted into the mirror, her heart ticking once, then steady again. A patrol car was right on her bumper. No siren, just the strobing lights and an aggressive closeness that made her knuckles tighten around the wheel. She glanced at her speedometer. 65. On the dot. No weaving, no lane changes. No cause. She signaled and pulled over, the tires crunching gravel as the desert wind began to pick up. As she came to a stop, Evelyn took a moment. A breath in, a breath out. She'd handled hostage negotiations, threats on U.S. soil, and sat across from war criminals with colder eyes than winter itself. But there was something about the silence behind her now. No movement, no approach. That felt different. Off. Predatory. She rolled down her window halfway, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. That old whisper stirred again. Not fear, not exactly, but a knowing. The officer finally emerged, tall, stiff, shadowed by the sun setting behind him. He didn't greet her, didn't introduce himself. Just barked, license and registration. "Good evening, officer," Evelyn said evenly, her tone controlled but respectful. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" "Nothing." His eyes didn't meet hers. His hand hovered near his hip. Not resting, hovering. Why would a man of the law begin with a threat instead of a reason? The silence between them was brittle, like old glass. Still, Evelyn moved slowly, narrating each motion. "I'm reaching into my purse on the passenger seat," she said. "My credentials are inside." Still no reply. Moments like this demand clarity but offer none. She pulled out her ID, holding out her badge and license. The man didn't take them, just glanced, then grinned faintly. "FBI?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. She nodded once. His next words were low, deliberate. "Step out of the vehicle." Evelyn didn't flinch. Not when he stepped closer, not when he gripped the door handle like it was a weapon. But inside, her instincts screamed. She'd read this story too many times, in classified reports, in civilian lawsuits, in memorials left by grieving mothers. And now, she was in the middle of one. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but firm, "you are not following protocol." His jaw clenched. The hand at his waist twitched. "I said," he snapped, "step out of the vehicle." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. If she stepped out now, she wouldn't be the federal director anymore. She wouldn't be the woman with decades of service or the expert in tactical defense. She would just be one thing in his eyes: a problem. Isn't it strange how quickly dignity can be stripped away in silence? He leaned in, fingers curling tighter around the door. Evelyn moved first, not aggressively, just intentionally, placing her left hand over the handle to stop him from yanking it open. "Step back," she warned. "You're out of line." But the warning only seemed to charge him. There was no recognition in his eyes, no understanding that the woman he was trying to intimidate had once trained law enforcement like him. Or perhaps he did know, and that was exactly the problem. He was not here to enforce the law, he was here to assert power. Where does someone learn that dominance means control over truth? Evelyn's breath slowed, but her pulse ticked faster. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was a test of restraint, of judgment, of survival. Behind the patrol car, the horizon darkened. The last light of day was fading, and with it, the hope that this could still end with words. And still, she did not move. Before Evelyn could say another word, the officer lunged. His hand clamped around her wrist, tight, fast, too much force for any routine stop. Reflexes born of years in the field kicked in. She yanked her arm back, not violently but firmly, a clear message: no further. "Get your hands off me," she commanded loud enough to carry beyond the car. Her voice, though calm, had steel in it. But that steel was met with fire. A second officer arrived, unannounced, unintroduced, his face unreadable, his nameplate missing. Reinforcements. Not for support, for escalation. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said. Not Director Monroe, not agent, not even miss, just ma'am. Like she was no one. Like her career, her title, her very personhood had vanished under the weight of flashing lights. How does a life of service become invisible in just one moment? She looked between the two officers. This wasn't confusion. It was intent, deliberate, practiced. She could feel it in the way they flanked her car. Tight angles, minimal words, maximum pressure. Then it happened. The first officer stepped back, and in one smooth, bone-chilling motion, drew his gun. The barrel pointed inches from her face. No commands, no warnings, just the cold eye of the weapon and the bitter quiet that followed. And in that silence, time slowed. Not for her, but for the truth that stood in that standoff. If a badge and a gun give someone unchecked power, who protects the innocent? For a moment, even the wind held its breath. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't cry. She met his eyes and stayed still. She had faced war zones quieter than this. Then, without warning, a voice cut through the air. "I'm recording this." The voice came from the shoulder of the road, clear, confident, and completely unexpected. "I'm recording this." It broke the moment like a crack in glass. Evelyn turned her head slightly, just enough to see the faint glow of a phone screen, held steady by a man standing a few feet away. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't interfering. He was witnessing. The officer with the gun froze. Not entirely. Just enough. To hesitate, to blink, to register that he was now the one being watched. The second officer shifted uneasily. For the first time, Evelyn saw it, the briefest flicker of doubt in his stance. Not remorse, just calculation. One phone, one voice, that's all it took to change the temperature of the night. Isn't it something how truth finds its way, even in the dark? Sirens in the distance, growing louder. Reinforcements again, but this time, Evelyn wasn't sure for whom. Her breathing steadied, the gun still hovering too close, but the balance of power was shifting. A second patrol car pulled up, then a third. Out stepped an officer, younger, alert, scanning the scene. His eyes landed on Evelyn and widened. Recognition. "Director Monroe?" he asked, voice tight with alarm. That one question dropped like thunder. The officer with the gun stepped back, slowly, the weapon lowering as shame and fear mingled in his expression. The second officer went pale. Silence again. This time, different. Heavy, but not dangerous. Just revealing. What happens when a lie begins to collapse in real time? In less than a minute, the first officer was disarmed and placed in handcuffs. His partner didn't speak, only looked away as his badge was taken. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, not yet, but in acknowledgement. Justice had not arrived, but it had taken its first breath. It all moved quickly after that. The officer who had drawn his weapon now stood frozen, his hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in disbelief. One of the arriving officers, calm and precise, approached and took the gun from his hand. Click. Safe. It was over. The shift in energy was almost physical, like the heat had drained out of the air. Evelyn watched as the man who moments ago had tried to dominate the situation now stood cuffed, staring at the ground. No words. No excuses. His partner, the silent one, didn't protest when his badge and weapon were collected. He simply nodded once, the way a man does when he knows there's no salvaging the moment. How many people never get this ending, never get to see the scales tip toward justice? The young officer, the one who had recognized her, approached carefully. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Evelyn gave him a long look. Not hard, not soft. Just honest. "No, but I will be." And that was the truth. She wasn't fine. Not yet. But she had her name. She had her story. And now, thanks to one recording, she had proof. The man with the phone stepped closer, middle-aged, ordinary-looking, the kind you pass in a store without remembering. He nodded at her, quietly. "Thought you might need someone to see it." Those words sat heavy in her chest. How many times had no one been there to see? As the officers took the man in cuffs to a patrol car, Evelyn looked at the flash of lights reflecting off the desert rocks. The same lights that once symbolized safety now carried a different meaning. Tonight, the uniform wasn't the shield. The camera was. By dawn, the world knew. The video had spread across the internet like fire on dry grass. News outlets clipped it into headlines. Civil rights groups demanded answers. The agency Evelyn led issued a swift, sharp statement. Full cooperation, full investigation. The officer who pulled the gun, his name now public, was no longer just a man in uniform. He was a face attached to a pattern. Within hours, he had been formally charged. Misconduct, assault, endangerment. His partner was suspended pending a separate review. Justice, it seemed, had a pulse. But Evelyn knew better than to mistake movement for healing. She sat at her desk later that morning, hands folded, eyes focused on the report in front of her. Their official version of events. sanitized, structured, cautious. Still, the video left little room for twisting the truth. How many others had sat in this same seat, reading versions of events written to protect everything but the truth? She turned her chair slightly, watching the sun rise through her office window. For all her years of service, this was the first time she'd felt the personal weight of what so many others had lived. She remembered the fear in her chest, the stillness of that gun, and the man with the phone. Quiet, steady, brave, without needing to be loud. Would any of this have happened if he hadn't stopped to bear witness? Later, as press conferences were called and statements prepared, Evelyn said little. Her words were few but deliberate. This was not about one officer, she told her staff. It's about the culture that lets him feel protected. Silence followed, and in that silence was the echo of a hard truth. Justice isn't just served, it's pushed, it's demanded. Sometimes it's recorded. By nightfall, the calls had slowed. The statements had been issued. The headlines, though still fresh, were beginning to shift. News cycles moved quickly, Evelyn knew that. But the lesson, what happened on that dusty road, was not something she would let the country forget. She sat alone in her living room, the television on mute. The footage played again, looping without sound. Her own face stared back from the screen, calm, composed, even with a gun inches from it. But Evelyn remembered the heat in her chest, the throb in her wrist where he'd grabbed her. And she remembered the silence of those moments, thick with something unspoken. How many others had experienced this same moment, but without a camera, without a witness? She turned off the screen. This wasn't about Evelyn Monroe anymore. This was about a system that gave certain men the belief they could act without consequence, and about what it takes to crack that illusion. The truth is, justice that comes only after being caught is not justice, it's rescue, and rescue doesn't reach everyone. She took a pen and wrote 2 words on a notepad beside her chair. Be seen. That's what saved her, not her badge, not her title, but the simple act of being witnessed. What if every person stopped on a dark road had someone watching? Would they be treated differently? The thought settled deep. Tomorrow she would speak publicly, not to recount her trauma, but to urge something bigger. Accountability, policy change, and protection for those without power. As the night closed in around her home, Evelyn lit a small lamp beside her and sat quietly. Because some battles aren't loud, they're quiet, personal, and won in moments when someone decides not to look away. Sometimes all it takes is one steady voice in the dark, one witness, one moment where someone chooses not to look away. Evelyn Monroe's story reminds us that dignity is not granted by titles or uniforms. It lives in how we carry ourselves, even when the world tries to diminish us. Injustice doesn't always shout. Often it comes in the form of silence, of looks not exchanged, of questions left unanswered. But justice, too, can begin quietly, with calm resistance, with truth spoken gently, or with a bystander pressing record. As we grow older, we've seen much, lived through storms, and held our ground through change. This story isn't just about one woman on a desert road. It's about every moment we've felt unseen and every time we chose to stay true to ourselves anyway. So let this be a quiet reminder. Your presence matters. Your voice matters. And even when the world goes quiet, you still have the power to stand for what's right. Because someone somewhere is watching and learning from your strength.